The smell hit them first. Not the salt air or diesel fumes they expected, but something impossible. Rich, savory, unmistakable. Fish stew. Real fish stew, with vegetables and spices, drifting across 3 miles of open Pacific water on the morning wind of September 14th, 1944. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Captain Elena Kovac stood at the helm of her fishing vessel, the Northern Star, squinting against the dawn light off the coast of what the Americans now called the Marshall Islands. Her crew, 8 fishermen from scattered villages along the Croatian coast, had been at sea for 16 days. Their hold contained exactly 43 pounds of dried fish, 2 barrels of brackish water, and hope measured in tablespoons. The war had stripped their waters bare. German submarines patrolled the Adriatic. Allied destroyers hunted anything that moved. Fishing boats were suspected, boarded, sometimes sunk on sight by either side. Elena's hands, calloused from 30 years of working nets, gripped the wheel tighter as the scent grew stronger. Her first mate, a weathered woman named Marta, who had lost 2 sons to the war, stepped beside her. Marta's eyes were closed, breathing deeply, and when she opened them, tears traced lines down her sun-darkened cheeks. "That smell," Marta whispered. "That's not military rations. That's real food. Vegetables, tomatoes maybe, onions, fish cooked with care, not just boiled in seawater." The crew gathered on deck, drawn by the impossible aroma. These were people who had survived on potato peels and nettle soup for months. Children back in their villages measured meals in ounces. The fishing cooperative that owned the Northern Star had sent them out with orders to catch anything, risk everything, because entire communities faced starvation. And now, carried on Pacific winds, came the smell of abundance so profound it seemed like a hallucination born from hunger. Elena made a decision that could mean death for all of them. She turned the Northern Star toward the scent. Her crew understood without words. They were fishermen, ocean readers, people who trusted their instincts about the sea. That smell meant something impossible was happening just beyond the horizon, and impossible things in wartime usually meant danger. But hunger makes gamblers of cautious people. As dawn broke fully, they saw it. An American destroyer, the USS Davidson, sitting at anchor in waters the Northern Star had fished a generation ago, when these islands belonged to no one's war. But that wasn't what made Elena's breath catch. On the destroyer's deck, in full view of anyone watching, American sailors stood around massive cooking pots. Not hiding, not rationing, cooking enough food that the smell carried miles across open water. Through her father's old binoculars, cracked lens held together with fishing line, Elena watched sailors stirring pots big enough to wash clothes in. She saw crates being opened, fresh vegetables, actual fresh vegetables, being chopped on cutting boards. She saw a young sailor, couldn't have been older than 19, laughing as he added something to a pot, then taste testing with a ladle, shaking his head like the seasoning wasn't quite right, like he had the luxury of making food taste good, not just edible. "They're cooking breakfast," Marta said, her voice hollow with disbelief. "For themselves, not because they have to, because they want it to taste good." The Northern Star's crew had eaten the last of their rice 3 days ago. They'd been splitting 1 can of sardines among 8 people for what they called dinner. Their drinking water had turned green. Several crew members showed signs of scurvy, their gums bleeding, old wounds refusing to heal. And here, floating in the same ocean, the same war, were men cooking a meal that smelled like something from before the world broke.
Elena knew approaching an American warship was suicide. European fishing vessels had been sunk for less. The Americans were fighting Japan, but they shot at anything that might be an enemy in disguise. Her boat, with its foreign markings and desperate appearance, would look exactly like the kind of threat destroyer captains were trained to eliminate. One wrong move, one misunderstood gesture, and the Northern Star would join the hundreds of vessels already resting on the ocean floor. But then, something happened that changed everything. A young American sailor, barely visible at this distance, appeared to notice their boat. He pointed. Other sailors looked. Elena's crew froze, waiting for the alarm, the gun turrets to swing in their direction, the warning shots across their bow. Instead, the sailor waved. Not a threatening gesture, not a warning. He waved like someone greeting neighbors across a fence. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Elena felt her chest tighten. She'd been at sea during both world wars. She'd seen ships burn. She'd pulled drowning men from water turned to fire by fuel oil. She'd learned that wartime meant trusting no one, expecting violence from everyone. And here was a boy young enough to be her grandson, waving at a suspicious foreign vessel like they were all just people sharing the same ocean. "We're going in," Elena announced. Her voice carried the authority of 3 decades commanding fishing crews in storms that swallowed ships. "Slowly, Marta, get the white sheet from my cabin. Tie it to the forward mast. Everyone else, hands visible, no sudden movements. If they shoot, they shoot. But if there's any chance they'll share what they're cooking, we're taking it." The white sheet, actually Elena's only clean bed sheet saved for emergencies exactly like this, went up the mast. The Northern Star's engine, burning the last of their fuel oil cut with rendered fish fat because they'd run out of diesel, spluttered and coughed as they approached. The sound alone announced their desperation. No military vessel made noises like that. They were clearly fishermen, clearly starving, clearly hoping for mercy. The American destroyer grew larger as they approached. Elena could now see individual faces, young men mostly, watching their approach with curiosity rather than hostility. The cooking continued. Whatever was in those pots kept sending its impossible smell across the water, and Elena realized something that made her throat tight. They weren't cooking rations. The portions being prepared were generous, wasteful by European standards. These sailors expected to eat until they were full, with leftovers. At 50 yards, a voice boomed across the water through a megaphone. American English, which Elena understood from her years working fishing boats that traded with British vessels before the war. "Fishing vessel, identify yourself and your intentions. We are United States Navy. Approach slowly and prepared to be boarded." Elena grabbed her own battered megaphone, a tin cone that barely amplified her voice. In her broken English, learned from British fishermen and American merchant sailors in peaceful times, she called back. "Northern Star, Croatian fishing vessel. 16 days at sea, no food, no water, 8 crew. We are fishermen only. We smelled your cooking. We are very hungry." The honesty of it, the raw admission of need, hung in the air between the vessels. For a long moment, nothing happened. Elena's crew stood frozen, hands visible, making themselves as non-threatening as possible. They were fishermen meeting a destroyer, minnows approaching a shark, betting everything that this particular shark might choose not to bite. Then movement on the destroyer, officers conferring, sailors gathering at the rail. Elena saw the young sailor who had waved earlier speaking urgently to an older man with more stripes on his uniform. The older man, Elena would later learn his name was Commander James Mitchell, looked at the Northern Star through his own binoculars. He was seeing what Elena knew he would see. A fishing boat held together with rope and prayer. A crew that looked like skeletons with sun-damaged skin. People who had clearly been at sea too long with too little. The megaphone voice returned, but different this time. Warmer if mechanical amplification could carry warmth. "Northern Star, hold your position. We're sending a boat over. Don't be alarmed. We're bringing food and water. You look like you could use both." Marta made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. Elena felt her knees weaken, and she gripped the wheel to stay upright. Bringing food. Not arresting them, not sinking them, not even just allowing them to leave. Bringing them food. In the middle of a war, in waters where submarines and aircraft killed without warning, American sailors were preparing to share their breakfast with enemy nationals who could have been anyone. A small motor launch detached from the destroyer, carrying 4 sailors and cargo that made Elena's vision blur with tears. Crates, multiple crates, and one of those massive cooking pots, still steaming, being carefully lowered into the launch. They weren't bringing military rations or emergency supplies. They were bringing the actual stew they'd been cooking, the meal that had drawn the Northern Star across miles of dangerous water. As the launch approached, Elena could see the sailors' faces clearly. They were young, most of them, but they moved with a casual confidence that spoke of people who'd never known true hunger. Their uniforms were clean, their faces were full, healthy, showing none of the gauntness that marked Elena's crew. But in their eyes, she saw something unexpected. Not pity, which would have been insulting. Not superiority, which would have been expected. She saw concern, the kind of immediate human response to seeing other people suffering. The launch pulled alongside. The lead sailor, a black man with sergeant stripes who introduced himself as Robert Hayes, called up in cheerful tones that seemed impossible given the circumstances. "Permission to come aboard, Captain. We brought breakfast, and we figured you could use some fresh water. We've got purification tablets, too, if your supply's contaminated." Elena nodded, not trusting her voice. Her crew helped secure the launch, moving with the automatic competence of people who'd worked boats their entire lives. The Americans climbed aboard, carrying their cargo like they were making a social call, not boarding a foreign vessel in hostile waters during wartime. The first crate contained water. Not recycled, not purified seawater, but fresh water in clean containers, cold and clear. Sergeant Hayes handed Elena a canteen. "Go ahead, Captain. It's good water, promise. We make it fresh on the ship every day." Elena drank, and the cold, clean water hitting her cracked lips and dry throat almost made her collapse. She passed the canteen to Marta, who drank and then openly wept, water spilling down her chin because she couldn't drink and cry at the same time. The canteen went around the crew, each person taking careful sips, trying to be disciplined, trying not to be greedy, but their shaking hands betrayed their desperation. Then came the stew. Sergeant Hayes and his team brought up the pot, still warm, steam rising in the morning air. They'd brought bowls, actual ceramic bowls and metal spoons, not mess kits, not whatever random containers were available. They'd brought proper dishes, like Elena and her crew were guests being served at a table. "It's fish stew," Hayes explained, ladling generous portions in the bowls. "We caught tuna yesterday, got fresh vegetables from the supply ship last week. Cook's specialty. He uses tomatoes, onions, potatoes, some spices. Nothing fancy, but it's hot and there's plenty." Nothing fancy? Elena took her bowl with hands that trembled so badly she nearly dropped it. She looked down at fish stew so thick with ingredients she could barely see the broth. Chunks of tuna. Real fish, not dried or salted, but fresh. Potato pieces, soft and steaming. Tomatoes. Actual tomatoes. Something she hadn't tasted in over a year. Onions. Carrots. Spices she could smell but not identify. This was nothing fancy. This was abundance beyond anything her village had seen since before the war began. Her crew ate in silence, tears mixing with stew, each spoonful a reminder of everything they'd lost and forgotten. Real food, prepared with care, served in portions meant to satisfy, not just sustain. Elena watched her crew members, hardened fishermen and women who'd survived storms and wars and years of deprivation, weeping openly as they ate American military stew that the sailors called nothing fancy. Sergeant Hayes watched the meat with quiet satisfaction, like their hunger fulfilled something in him. "We've got more," he said gently. "Plenty more. You don't have to rush. Take your time, enjoy it. When you're done, we brought extra supplies. Canned goods, dried fish, rice, medical supplies. Enough to get you home safe." Elena stood on the deck of the Northern Star, watching Sergeant Hayes and his crew unload supplies with an efficiency that spoke of practice. They'd done this before, she realized. Feeding desperate people wasn't an accident or a one-time kindness. These American sailors had a system for helping strangers in a war zone where trust meant risking everything. The crates kept coming. Canned vegetables, beans, peaches in syrup that made Marta gasp when she saw the labels. Dried fish, properly preserved, not the half-rotted scraps they'd been eating. Rice in sealed bags that would last months. Medical supplies, including bandages, iodine, something Hayes called sulfa powder for infections, and vitamins in bottles with instructions printed in multiple languages. The Americans had prepared for this, anticipated meeting desperate people,
and equipped themselves to help. "Captain," Hayes said quietly, pulling Elena aside while her crew examined their unexpected fortune like children on Christmas morning. "We need to talk about your situation. You're a long way from home. Your boat's in rough shape, and these waters aren't safe for anyone, especially fishermen. Where are you trying to get to?" Elena explained in her halting English, sometimes searching for words, sometimes using hand gestures when language failed. Her village on the Croatian coast, once prosperous from fishing, now starving because the war had destroyed the industry. The collective that owned the Northern Star had sent them out in desperation, fishing in international waters because their traditional grounds were minefields and submarine hunting zones. They'd been at sea 16 days, caught almost nothing, and were attempting to reach a neutral port in South America where they hoped to sell what little they had and buy supplies to bring home. Hayes listened with the patient attention of someone who understood that survival stories required time to tell properly. When Elena finished, he nodded slowly. "South America's a long shot in your condition, Captain. Your engine's dying, you're low on fuel, and there are Japanese submarines between here and there. But I might have a better option." He called over another sailor, a young woman with navigator stripes on her uniform, who spread a water-stained chart on a crate top. "Lieutenant Sarah Chen," she introduced herself, pointing to coordinates with confident precision. "There's an Allied supply depot on this island, about 2 days from here at your current speed. We can spare enough fuel to get you there. They've got repair facilities, more supplies, and they can arrange transport for fishing crews trying to get home. You'd be safer there than trying to make it to South America on hope and fish oil." Elena studied the chart, her fisherman's knowledge of currents and weather patterns calculating the journey. 2 days was manageable if the weather held and their engine didn't fail completely. But approaching an Allied military installation in a foreign vessel carried its own risks. Hayes seemed to read her thoughts. "I'll radio ahead. Give them your description, explain your situation. They'll be expecting you. These supply depots, they're not just for military. The Allies are trying to help civilians caught in the war zones. You're fishermen, not combatants. They'll treat you right." The casual way he said it, like helping enemy nationals was standard procedure, revealed something about American military culture that Elena struggled to comprehend. Her experience with military forces involved checkpoints, suspicion, supplies confiscated, fishermen arrested for being in wrong places at wrong times. The idea of military installations dedicated partly to civilian aid seemed like propaganda, except she was living the reality of it. These sailors had fed them, supplied them, and were now arranging safe passage to a facility that would help them further. Marta approached, carrying an empty bowl with the reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. "The stew's gone," she said softly. "Every drop. The crew's asking if we can keep the bowls. To remember, to prove this happened when we tell people back home." Hayes smiled, the kind of genuine warmth that transcended language and culture. "Keep them. We've got plenty. And here, take these too." He pulled out a camera, one of those small, portable ones that American soldiers seem to carry everywhere, and gestured for Elena's crew to gather. "Let's get a picture, something to show your families." The photograph was taken on the deck of the Northern Star. American sailors standing alongside Croatian fishermen, everyone squinting in the bright Pacific sunlight. Elena stood in the center, flanked by Hayes on one side and Lieutenant Chen on the other.
Her crew, still holding their precious bowls, managed smiles that mixed exhaustion with disbelief. One of Hayes's sailors, a young man from somewhere he called Nebraska, insisted on being in the photo holding a fish from their meager catch, making everyone laugh with his exaggerated struggle to hold the small specimen like it was a prize marlin. For the folks back home, they'll never believe we met Croatian fishermen in the middle of the Pacific. This photo's going in every letter I write for a month. As the Americans prepared to return to their destroyer, Hayes pulled out a small notebook and carefully wrote down information: the Northern Star's destination, their home village coordinates, even Elena's full name and the names of her crew. "When this war ends," he said, handing her a copy, "I'm going to find you. Come visit, meet your family, see where you fish. My grandmother
Was a fisherman's wife in Maine. She'd want to hear your stories." The simple humanity of it, planning for after the war like survival was guaranteed, like friendship between former enemies was not just possible but expected, made Elena's throat tight. In her world, you didn't plan beyond the next day. You survived. You endured. You hoped not to die. These Americans moved through the war with the confidence of people who knew they'd live to see its end, who made lunch plans for years in the future. Lieutenant Chen had one more surprise. From her pack, she pulled out a small wooden box, hand-carved with intricate patterns. "This is from our ship's carpenter," she explained. "He makes these for good luck. It's supposed to bring safe voyages. We want you to have it." Inside the box was a compass, not fancy but functional, with a note in careful English handwriting. "For fishermen who followed their noses to friendship, may you always find your way home. USS Davidson Crew, September 1944. Elena accepted it with both hands, the formal gesture of receiving something sacred. She'd been at sea 30 years and owned 3 compasses, all of them inherited or salvaged. No one had ever given her one as a gift, certainly not enemy sailors in the middle of a war. The compass was worth more than money. It was trust, friendship, hope carved into brass and sealed in wood. The motor launch finally pulled away, Americans waving as they returned to their destroyer. Elena's crew stood at the rail, still holding their bowls, watching until the launch was secured and the destroyer began moving away. As it disappeared over the horizon, the smell of diesel exhaust mixed with the lingering scent of fish stew, and Elena realized they were crying again. Not from hunger this time, but from the overwhelming realization that kindness still existed in a world trying to destroy itself. The Northern Star continued toward the supply depot with enough fuel to make the journey, enough food to feed the crew properly, and enough hope to believe they might actually survive this war. The engine still coughed and sputtered, but it ran. The crew still looked gaunt, but they'd eaten real food and would eat again tomorrow. The war still raged across oceans and continents, but for 8 fishermen on a dying boat, American sailors had proven that humanity wasn't dead, just harder to find. They reached the supply depot 36 hours later, guided by the compass in its carved box and Lieutenant Chen's coordinates. The facility was exactly as Hayes promised, a converted island base where military personnel worked alongside civilian aid organizations. They were expected, welcomed by name, and treated not as refugees or enemy nationals, but as fellow survivors of an insane war that was slowly eating the world. The base commander, a weathered woman named Colonel Patricia Morrison, who'd served in 3 different countries, greeted Elena personally. "Sergeant Hayes radioed ahead, said you were fishermen who followed their noses to a ship. That's the best navigation story I've heard in months. Welcome to Henderson Station. Let's get your boat fixed and get you home." Over the following week, while mechanics repaired the Northern Star's engine and carpenters patched holes that Elena had considered permanent, the Croatian crew lived among American military personnel and discovered a culture that confused everything they thought they knew about war. The Americans worked hard, but they also played baseball during off hours. They maintained discipline, but they also threw parties with live music and dancing. They prepared for combat,
But they also ran a school for local children whose villages had been destroyed. The mess hall served 3 hot meals daily, with portions generous enough that Elena's crew initially thought they were being specially favored, until they realized everyone ate the same. Breakfast included eggs, real eggs, fresh fruit, bread with butter. Lunch offered choices, multiple options like peacetime restaurants. Dinner was elaborate, with meat, vegetables, desserts, and coffee that didn't taste like burned dirt. The Americans ate like this every day, treated it as normal, complained when the coffee wasn't fresh enough or the bread wasn't warm enough. Marta, helping in the kitchen as payment for their stay, watched American cooks prepare meals and came back to Elena shaking her head. "They throw away food," she whispered, scandalized. "Not spoiled food, good food, because they made too much. They don't save it, don't ration it for tomorrow. They throw it away and cook fresh the next day. I watched them discard enough bread to feed my village for a week." The waste horrified and amazed in equal measure. This wasn't inefficiency or ignorance. It was abundance so complete that excess was acceptable, expected, built into the system. The Americans hadn't just defeated scarcity in their own country. They'd exported that
Victory to military bases scattered across the world, ensuring their soldiers never experienced the hunger that motivated enemy forces. On their 5th day at Henderson Station, Colonel Morrison invited Elena to her office for coffee. Real coffee with cream and sugar, served in china cups that seemed absurd in a military facility. The office was organized chaos, maps covering walls, reports stacked on every surface, but Morrison moved through it with practiced ease. "Your boat will be ready tomorrow," Morrison said, settling into her chair with the comfortable authority of someone who'd earned their rank through competence. "New engine parts, patched hull, enough fuel and supplies to reach neutral ports with reserves. But I want to talk about after. What happens when you get home?" Elena explained the situation honestly. Her village was starving. The fishing fleet, once 40 boats, was down to 7. Young people had been conscripted or fled. The collective had mortgaged everything to keep the remaining boats operating, betting on catches that never came because the fish populations had collapsed from overfishing, pollution, and underwater explosions. Going home meant returning to slow starvation, but it was home. Morrison listened, making notes, asking occasional questions. When Elena finished, the colonel opened a drawer and pulled out forms, official documents with stamps and seals. "We have a program," she explained. "Civilian Assistance Initiative. It's designed to help non-combatants in war zones rebuild their livelihoods. Fishing communities qualify. If you're interested, we can arrange supplies, equipment loans, even training in new fishing techniques. It's not charity. You'd be expected to pay it back after the war when your catches recover, but it might give your village a chance." The offer was so unexpected, so contrary to everything Elena understood about wartime, that she initially thought she'd misunderstood. But Morrison was serious, sliding the forms across her desk, explaining terms and conditions with patient professionalism. The Americans weren't just feeding individual fishermen they encountered. They had an entire bureaucratic program dedicated to helping civilian populations survive the war, rebuild afterward, create futures beyond the immediate horror. "Why?" Elena finally asked, the question covering everything. Why help enemy nationals? Why waste resources on fishing villages when the war demanded every bullet, every can of fuel, every ounce of effort? Why care about Croatian fishermen when Americans were dying in Pacific battles? Morrison set down her coffee cup with deliberate care. "Because the war will end," she said simply. "Maybe next year, maybe in 5 years, but it will end. And when it does, the world will need fishermen. Villages will need to function. Communities will need to rebuild. If we only focus on winning battles and ignore the people caught between the armies, we'll win the war but lose the peace. The fish stew that brought you to the Davidson wasn't an accident, Captain. It's policy. We feed people. We help communities. We try to make sure there's something worth saving when the shooting stops." The philosophy was revolutionary to Elena.
who'd lived through wars where armies consumed everything and left populations to starve. The idea that a military force would deliberately choose to use resources helping civilians, not as propaganda or strategy, but as a fundamental principle, suggested a completely different understanding of what military power meant. The Americans weren't just fighting to defeat enemies. They were fighting to create a world where fish stew could be shared freely, where fishermen could return to villages that still existed, where normalcy could resume after the madness ended. Elena signed the forms with Morrison's pen, committing her village to a program that would provide fishing nets, engine parts, navigation equipment, and training in exchange for repayment after the war. It was hope in bureaucratic format, faith in survival converted to official documents with multiple copies. Morrison promised to forward everything to the appropriate offices to ensure the supplies would be waiting when Elena's village could receive them safely. On their last evening at Henderson Station, the Americans threw what they called a farewell party. The mess hall was decorated with handmade banners, someone had obtained bottles of wine from who knows where, and a sailor from Louisiana played accordion while others danced. Elena's crew, initially reluctant, were pulled into the celebration by Americans who refused to accept no for an answer. Language barriers dissolved in music and laughter. Marta danced with Sergeant Hayes, both of them laughing at their complete inability to coordinate steps. The sailor from Nebraska taught basic English phrases while learning Croatian curse words, a linguistic exchange that had everyone in tears from laughing. Colonel Morrison stood beside Elena, watching the party with satisfaction. "This is what we're fighting for," she said quietly. "Not territory or resources or ideology. For nights like this, for people from different worlds sharing food and music and laughter, for the radical idea that we're all just humans trying to survive together." The next morning, the Northern Star departed Henderson Station with an engine that purred, supplies that would last months, and a crew transformed by the realization that enemies could become friends over shared bowls of fish stew. They had photographs, addresses, promises to write letters, and the carved compass that Elena placed in the wheelhouse as a permanent reminder. The journey home took 3 weeks, navigating through waters that were slowly becoming safer as the war ground toward its inevitable conclusion. They stopped at ports where Allied forces controlled the harbors, and at each one, when Elena explained they'd been helped by the USS Davidson crew, doors opened. Food was shared, fuel was provided, minor repairs were completed without charge. Sergeant Hayes's radio message had apparently traveled through military communication networks, marking the Northern Star as friends who'd followed their noses to an act of kindness that rippled outward. When they finally reached their village in late October 1944, gaunt faces that had given them up for dead crowded the dock. Elena's crew brought more than fish and supplies. They brought stories that seemed impossible, evidence that contradicted everything their community believed about the war. They brought photographs of Americans and Croatians smiling together. They brought forms promising assistance. They brought hope that survival might be possible. The carved compass stayed in Elena's wheelhouse for the rest of her life. After the war, when fishing slowly resumed and the village rebuilt, she never made a voyage without it. The compass didn't point any truer than her others, but it reminded her that kindness existed even in the darkest times, that enemies could choose humanity over hatred, that the smell of fish stew could be more powerful than any weapon. Sergeant Hayes kept his promise. In 1947, 2 years after the war ended, he traveled to Croatia to visit the fishing village he'd helped save. Elena took him fishing in the Northern Star, now fully repaired with equipment provided by the Civilian Assistance Initiative. They caught tuna, cooked fish stew using his recipe, and shared it with the village. The bowls from that morning in 1944 were brought out like treasures, each crew member having kept theirs, and Hayes signed them with permanent marker, dating each one and adding the words, "Friendship Across Oceans." The story of the Northern Star became village legend, told to children who needed to understand that human decency survives even when the world tries to destroy it. The photographs hung in the cooperative's office, faded and yellowed, but carefully preserved. The carved compass was eventually donated to a maritime museum, accompanied by a plaque explaining how Croatian fishermen followed their noses to discover that abundance shared creates bonds stronger than war can break. Elena lived to be 87, fishing almost until the end. She kept in contact with Hayes through letters that spanned decades, trading updates about catches and grandchildren and the slow process of healing that follows trauma. She never forgot the taste of that fish stew, the first real food after weeks of starvation, or the lesson it taught about choosing kindness when cruelty would be easier. In her final interview before passing, recorded by a journalist documenting wartime experiences, Elena was asked what she learned from that morning in 1944 when the smell of fish stew changed everything. She thought for a long moment, hands still showing the calluses of lifelong fishing, eyes still sharp from scanning horizons. I learned that power is not just the ability to destroy. Real power is the ability to help, to share, to create abundance and then give it away freely. The Americans had ships, guns, planes, but what defeated us, what made us understand we were fighting people we should have been friends with, was fish stew. They had so much they could share it with strangers who might have been enemies. That's power. That's strength. That's what it means to have truly won when you can afford to be kind.